Hello, my name is Anita C Young, and I will be doing a color tutorial with the Prsimacolor Premier using the Laura Lee Color Joy Mandala. I have the 72 color set, which has 3 different palettes, but I will just be using the first one, which has a more limited range of colors. There's a lot of grays and muted tones. But I'm hoping to show that just because there's muted tones doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to get a vibrant, beautiful color. And in total, I'll be using about 8 different colors. I start off with a purple color, and I'm just gently shading from the inside out. I want the center to be darkest, so I use the most pressure there, and I shade with the lightest pressure on the outside. And I repeat this for every one of the leaves. I am going to go into time lapse now just to speed up the process, because all I'm going to do is continue shading the purple from the inside out again, more pressure on the inside until there's barely any pressure on the outside, almost white. The name of this purple is Imperial Violet. Once I have colored from the inside out using different pressures, I will then be using another secondary color. This one is a light blue called Cloud Blue. With the Cloud Blue, I will be blending from the outside in just to create a smoother gradient with the Imperial Violet. As you can see, it adds a smoother gradient as well as a slight blue touch, which I will use in many other places, so it'll give the image cohesion. At this point, I am using a fair amount of pressure to burnish the paper. It creates this waxy sheen, since the pencils that I am using are wax based, which creates an area where it blends more smoothly. Once I finished with the burnishing using the Cloud Blue, I then went back in and deepened the center using a Copenhagen Blue to create a deepened area where the shadows would be. After going in with the Copenhagen Blue, I went back in with the Cloud Blue just to create a more smooth gradient again. You can use lighter colors to try and create a smooth variant to create a nicer blend and get rid of pencil marks. Next, I started in on the leaves, and I knew I wanted to create a more muted palette. I started with a warm gray. It's the 50% warm gray, and I am just going along the veins of the leaves to color in and create a shadowy area. After coloring in the veins with the 50% gray, I then went back in over the veins with a jade green just to create a softer area of color. Eventually I will go in over that and add a stronger color. Now I am further deepening the vein color with gray, and this one is 70% warm gray. Now that I've set the highlights and the shading for the leaves, I'm going to go in and add a little pop of color using parrot green. And I will just repeat this process with all the following leaves. After completing the leaves, I decided to add a little more shading around the flower where it would be recessed more and the light would be hitting it less. Next, I wanted to add a little bit of highlights, so I used a nice warm yellow called Sunburst Yellow to just add a warm yellow note to the greens that I had added in the highlight areas. Next, I decided that the flower needed a little more warmth, so I added a deep purple called Dark Purple to the center just to give it more depth. I then used the jade green to just blend it all out again. Using the Copenhagen blue, I again went into the leaves and just darkened the center areas. I then used the yellow to touch the areas of the leaves to brighten them where the sun would hit the most. So I tend to use them on the edges of the leaves and the flattest, most brightest part. Next I move on to the outer curl of the leaf where I kind of wanted to appear silvery blue, and so I start with the Copenhagen blue. Next I use the jade green to color in the mid-tones of the area of the leaf, while using the cloud blue to try to preserve the highlight. Next I go in with the dark purple to add some warmth to the shadows of the leaves. To add some contrast to the cooler tones of the center flower and leaves, I am using the sunburst yellow on the ring around the flower. Since it's quite a dark yellow orange, I am using it in a darker part of the crevices where the light might not reach quite as much, to try to create the illusion of light hitting the tips, which might be coming up, while the corner of the V would be receiving less light and therefore be darker. To aid with this illusion, I use terracotta. It's a nice warm brown, which will aid in creating the darker colors of the shadows. Next, I go in with beige. This is a nice yellowish color that will create a lighter tone for the highlight section. In addition, I will use it to burnish the colors together to create a nice smooth gradient like I did for the other area. Finally, I added a little bit of cloud blue just to the points to add a little more harmony for the colors in the scheme. For the lacy inside, I decided to use a Copenhagen blue with very light pressure to create this beautiful blue, just hinting at the insides, picking up the colors that are in the leaves as well as the flowers. In order to blend that out and create a more smooth gradient, I used cloud blue just to smooth it all together. I then decided to go back and add just a little more saturated color to the flower using the Imperial Violet. At the tips of the ring, I start with a dark color. It is Copenhagen blue, just to add the deep shading in the center. I then created a gradient from the Copenhagen blue into the Imperial Violet. And finally I went in with cloud blue to create the gradient with the burnishing that I've used it previously, and to add just a little bit of color to the highlight. I also wanted to add a little bit of the warmth to the four corners that I had with the center one, so I went back in with the dark purple just to add a little bit of warmth. I repeat this process until I'm happy with the gradient. Next, I move into the beads that are separating the panes extending from the flower, and for them I just chose the gold color to just carry that theme through. I started coloring the beads with the beige color, and I was sure to leave a section for the highlights, so I'm creating just a darker area that I want with the beige. Next, I went in and made the darker shade, which I decided would be towards the flower while the highlights would be away from the flower. So the darker shaded areas, which would be the innermost parts, shaded with the terracotta. Next, I chose to add the highlights to each of the little beads using lemon yellow. Next, I moved on to the greenery, starting with the 70% gray. I added this to areas where I assumed the shading would be. Next, I went in with the jade green in a similar fashion to when we colored the leaves on the inside. Next, I went in with the parrot green to add the saturation of the color. And next, I went in with lemon yellow this time to add even brighter highlights. And finally, I deepened the shade with the dark purple. I repeated this process with all the leaves and vines in the area. Next, I moved into the beads in the interior panes. I used the same process as the beads that separated each of the panes, with the beige first, followed by the terracotta in the shading area, and then the lemon yellow for the highlights. For the center of the flowers, I also used the sunburst yellow just to give some differentiation. Next, I used Crimson Lake on the little flowers. I colored the Crimson Lake on the outside, and then I used the Copenhagen Blue to color the insides. Then I brought in Cloud Blue to burnish the colors together to create a more soft gradient. I then went in with the Copenhagen Blue to again deepen the center, and I repeated this process for all of the flowers. Next, I moved back to the vines that were on the outside of the panes. I started this process with 70% warm gray and then filled in each of the vines with the jade green. Over the jade green, I then added parrot green to just up the saturation of green. And finally, I went in and added highlights using lemon yellow. I then moved on to the center beaded area, the lacy area, and I decided I wanted to carry the lacy from the blue inside to this area. So I started with Copenhagen blue. For this, I did not press very hard because Copenhagen blue is quite a dark color, and while I wanted the hue of the blue, I did not want the deep saturated color. After finishing with the Copenhagen blue, I then went in with the cloud blue again to just create a softer gradient and add a little color. Next, I decided to work on the vines in this pane as well, so I again started with 70% warm gray to lock in the shading of each of the vines. Next, I added the jade green just all over the vines to create a nice solid background. From there, I moved on to parrot green to add the saturated parts of color to the highlighted section. And finally, I went in with the lemon yellow to further accent the highlights of the green vines. To further emphasize the shading as well as the tie-in red of the color scheme, I then went in with the dark purple and just further darkened the shading. Next, I moved on to the little flowers on the interior of the pane and decided that I wanted them to also echo a little bit of the blue of the lace as well as a little bit of the purple of the flowers. So I started with the imperial purple and colored just the edges where I wanted the color to be fading in from. Then I used the cloud blue to drag in some of the color from that and burnish in just a little more of the light blue to again create a cohesive color scheme. I then went back and added a little more of the imperial violet just to the edges of the flowers to add just a little more depth of color. Then I decided that I wanted to tie in a little more of the yellow that is popping up in the rings and the beads, so I added just a hint of yellow to the center parts of the leaves, or the petals, using lemon yellow. I repeated this process for the inner flowers next to the inner ring. Next, I decided to tie in a little more of the purple color using imperial violet and adding it to the frilly portion on the outside of the rings. I chose to use the same method that I had used for the lace, adding a light coating of the imperial purple to the outside and just fading it inwards. I then used cloud blue to drag or to color in the area just to smooth out the gradient and to create again a more cohesive color scheme. Next, I moved on to the center parts of the flower using the sunburst yellow and creating highlight areas with the lemon yellow and deepening the folds of the flowers with the terracotta. I then used the lemon yellow like I had used on the previous flowers to bring in a little bit of the yellow into the purple petals. And again darken just the very edges of the petals with the imperial violet. I then decided that the little tendrils would have green leaves shooting off from them, so I used the same pattern that I did for the rest of the vines, so laying down the 70% warm gray first in the shadowed areas. When laying down the shaded part, you need to decide where your sun or where your light source is coming from. I sort of viewed this piece as having looking down into a kaleidoscope of colors, so my light source was technically above, so anything that I felt like was above would receive the lighter colors, while anything I thought would be facing away from it received the darker colors. Next, I added the jade green over it to lay down a solid base, as I have done with the previous vine. I then used the parrot green to add the highlighted areas to where I figured the light source would be shining on. And then next I used the lemon yellow just to lighten the parrot green on areas that I really thought would be hit by the light. I then went back in with the dark purple to just darken the shaded areas. Next, I decided to bring that purple blue coloring that I had done in the other panes into this pane in the swooping area below the vines. So I started with the Crimson Lake for the outside area, just as I had done with the petals, followed by the Copenhagen Blue for the darker inside. I then went in with Cloud Blue over the Crimson Lake and Copenhagen Blue, just to blend them together a little more. To add a little more depth to the color, I then went back in with the Copenhagen Blue just to deepen the shadows. Next, I added the Copenhagen to the frill on the outside of these loops to echo the blue of the lace on the innards, and then blended it out as with the lace to create a gradient with the cloud blue. Next, I moved on to the gold ring again, starting with beige. I kept the beige mostly to the highlighted areas of the ring. Next, I used sunburst yellow in the mid-tones to dark areas. And then finally I used terracotta to deepen the darkest areas of the gold ring. For the terracotta, I use a very gentle pressure so as not to darken the area too much. I then went back in again with the sunburst yellow just to to take away some of the pencil marks and create a nice smooth gradient. Next, I moved on to the flowers on the outside, where I decided to use the same golden technique that I've used for the flowers on the inside, starting with the sunburst yellow and then again using the terracotta to darken where the folds would be. Next, I moved on to the petals, where I used the imperial purple on the outside and lightly shaded inside, and then used the cloud blue to blend it all inwards. And to just tie the yellow back into the flowers, I added just a hint on the innards of the petal using lemon yellow. Next, I moved to the exterior rings, where I then used Copenhagen blue as I had with the interior lace and just created a gentle gradient with very light pressure on the outside. I also decided the ring needed to be gold as well to carry the theme throughout. So I started coloring the ring with beige. In the darker portions of the ring and the midtones, I again used sunburst yellow, darkening it even further with the terracotta. I then went back and decided to color in the little vines that are between the two golden rings using the same technique as I have been using, starting with the 70% warm gray to start mapping out the shadowed area, followed by then using some jade green to fill the area in. Then I used the dark purple to further map out the shaded areas. Then I added the parrot green to the highlighted areas, and finally added the lemon yellow to the most highlighted areas. I then realized I had not finished my lace area and used my cloud blue to go back in and smooth out the gradient. As I had done in some areas, decided to go back in with the Copenhagen blue and just create a really dark saturated rim. I then decided to carry the cloud blue to some of the highlighted areas of the gold rings. Next, I moved on to the little leaves surrounding the gold rings, which I decided to use the same technique I had been using with the vines on the interior. So I started with 70% warm gray. Then filled the area in with the jade green. Then darkening the shadows with the dark purple, then adding parrot green to the highlight. I then went back and darkened the ring a little bit up using the sunburst yellow. Then I moved on to the next ring, again starting with beige, using the sunburst yellow for the midtones, and then darkening those midtones up with the terracotta. The next layer of lace I decided would be the imperial violet, which I would then blend out with the cloud blue. I then added a hint of crimson lake to the imperial violet, just to tie in more of the crimson lake color that I had used on the interior. For the next layer of the lace, I decided to use a crimson lake and then blend it out again with the cloud blue. I decided to add a little more warmth with just a little bit of sunburst yellow to that lace ring. I then moved on to the next layer of the outer ring, which was just another layer of the vines using the same technique I'd used before, starting with the 70% warm gray, then filling in the area with the jade green. Then darkening the deep parts with the dark purple, and then adding the parrot green to the highlighted areas, and finally adding some lemon yellow to the very tip. Next, I decided to add a little bit of the imperial violet to the crimson lake ring. And then I moved on to the final golden ring, starting again with the beige, then moving to the sunburst yellow. I made the next layer of the lace, the imperial violet, which I then smoothed out with cloud blue. And the last ring I made the Copenhagen blue, which I then again smoothed out with a cloud blue. I then finished out the last layer of the vines in the same manner as I had been doing, with the 70% warm gray at the center, followed by the jade green, then adding the parrot green to the edges, and then finally adding a little dark purple to the center. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it useful, and I will see you again.